Life in the medieval period looked like lots of different things to lots of different people. Your place in society could dictate everything, from what food you ate, where you could go, how educated you were, and even how long you were likely to live for. Across this series, we'll discover what life was like for those that worked, those that earned, those that learned, and those that played in medieval England.
Today we're here at Denny Abbey, which is a really exciting place to think about the various strands of medieval society. In the fields around the abbey, you would have peasants working. Peasants make up about 80% of the European population in the medieval period, and they are out in the fields growing the crops necessary for everybody to survive, and for grand places like Denny Abbey to keep going. So if we're going to talk about peasants, what is a peasant? It doesn't just mean a poor person or someone who's lowly, which is kind of the way that we use it now. A peasant very specifically means a farmer. It's somebody who is tied to the land and they're out there farming. And it's the great majority of people in medieval Europe. 80% of the European medieval population as a whole are peasants. Underneath that, 70% of the European population are serfs, which means that they are peasants who are unfree or tied to the land. They live and work on strips of land that they rent from someone, a landlord, and they can't just decide that they want to move. They are seen as almost property in parcel with the land. So say a great lord or something inherits a manor, it's also assumed that they inherit the people that live on the manor as well. That sounds pretty bad, and to be honest, it is pretty bad. Being unfree isn't anybody's first choice. However, there are some rights that kind of go along with that as well. So you can't move down the road, but also your landlord can't kick you off your land. You are paying rent, but it is considered to be something that's in your family, and generations of serfs will pass the same land down through their family. So if serfs are tied to the land and they're paying rent to landlords, what is a landlord? The hint is kind of in the name. The lord is the pejorative here. So a lot of people who are landlords come from the nobility and noble houses. And we'll talk more about those later as well. But to be a landlord doesn't necessarily mean that one is a lord. Oftentimes, a landlord could be another peasant who is free and very well-to-do, or quite often, the church. On the one hand, medieval peasants in the countryside are all good Christians, so they're going to be happy that there are people in the abbey praying for their souls. On the other hand, they're the ones that pay for all of this. The abbey is also not doing their own farming. If you're spending all day long praying, or you're a retired monk like the Knights Templar, you're not going to be the one out in the fields plowing. It's the peasants who do the actual work that sustains the abbey. It's also interesting because since the abbey is enclosed, this is as close as any average medieval peasant would actually get to the abbey itself. You see this grand edifice that you're paying for, and you know that people are praying in it, but it's never something that you're going to be able to see from the inside. As we'll see, tensions like this eventually reach a boiling point. Peasants get really tired with their specific lot in life and the idea that they should simply be paying for everything around them with their own sweat. Farming in the medieval period is very interesting, I promise. This is because there are a lot of really big innovations that happen in the medieval period in terms of technology. Here is a really cool bit of medieval innovation. It's a causeway. What it is a raised bit of road that allows peasants to move their goods back and forth across the farmland here. As you can tell from all of the water behind me, here in the fens, it used to mostly be a bunch of marshes. A really neat medieval innovation is the draining of those marshes and turning them into arable land. It wasn't until the high medieval period that people actually knew how to do this. So previous to this, the entire fenland was really mostly unusable. When we talk about peasants and farming, and we're on historical farmland like this, it's really easy to forget that this isn't actually how things always looked for medieval farmers. What we see here is an example of what we call enclosed farming. When we see things like hedgerows and fences, that indicates that it's owned by one farmer who owns that land. That's not how farming works in the medieval period. The way that landlords kind of divvy out land for the various serfs and peasants that they oversee is generally through what we call the open field system. They've got 2 or 3 large fields, and then they might also have a common grazing ground for stuff like animals and livestock. They might also, if they're particularly well-to-do, have a couple of mill ponds so they can grind their own wheat into flour, and they might also have some fishing rights on those ponds as well. The way that land is then divided up further is through renting out the various strips of the fields into what are called sellions. So each family will have a certain number of sellions that they are responsible for tilling over time. And these will be passed down through generations in the same family, although they do pay rent to the landlord overall in order to farm them. Beyond draining fenlands and turning it into arable land, there's also a really cool medieval farming invention called the 3-field system. The 3-field system is when you alternate various strips of land and cultivate different things on it. So one year you might grow a crop that particularly strips a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. The next year you would then allow that same strip of land to go fallow and just take a bit of a break. Then the year after that, you would plant a crop, something like alfalfa, that puts a lot of nitrogen back into the soil. Then you can rotate in your crop that is going to pull a lot of nitrogen out again. This allows you to constantly be using land and constantly farming something without exhausting anything completely. This is important when you have really highly cultivated areas of land and a lot of people attempting to live off exactly the same parcels. So what are people farming? It really depends on the region that you're in. We know that they are farming wheat, barley, oats, rye, peas, and what are called vetches. Vetches are a kind of pea-adjacent crop that you kind of feed to horses and cattle and stuff like that. They're very important because they are one of those nitrogen-rich crops, which is going to enhance your soil after you've leached it out with a bunch of wheat. They're also raising livestock. So they're raising cattle, they're raising horses, they're raising pigs, all types of poultry. And excitingly, I promise, sheep. Luckily for medieval people, one of the best things that you can do with land that's been recently reclaimed is run sheep through it. Sheep are particularly important because they are covered in the miracle fiber that stays warm even when it's wet, wool. And wool is one of the most important and widely traded commodities in the medieval world. There are all sorts of trade routes which spring up specifically just to trade wool back and forth. What does this mean for peasants? Well, you can actually become pretty rich trading wool. This is especially true in England in the 14th century, when England, well, London more specifically, joins what's called the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League are a number of northern European towns, kind of along the North Sea and in the Baltic Sea, that trade wool and cloth back and forth. These are long international routes, and it's a good way to make very good money if you're a peasant. We do know that there are rich peasants, so they are not only getting by, but they're doing pretty well for themselves. And this might be through trading the actual vegetables, it might be through trading wool, or it might be engaging in other industries that are considered cottage, like brewing or weaving. And in fact, that's where we get the term cottage industry. It's something that someone might be doing in their cottage, unsurprisingly. So if you're growing a bunch of sheep, maybe you're also carding that wool and you're weaving it into cloth. Interestingly, both brewing and weaving are specific feminine industries. They're out there helping to till the land, certainly, but they might also be doing a second shift on top of that, making things like cloth and beer that can also be sold at market. This absolutely gorgeous medieval barn is a wonderful reminder of how important farm animals are in the medieval period. Because let's remember, this is owned by the abbey. So even monks and nuns are keeping their own cows, their own sheep, their own horses, and that's the sort of thing they could even do themselves. They don't necessarily need peasants to do it. If you want milk and butter, that isn't something you can get from the store in the medieval period. You've got to get it from a cow. It reminds us that all communities probably have their own farm animals in the countryside. So you have a really great and impressive barn like this to keep your animals inside, and to also keep crops like hay for the winter. Farm animals aren't just important because of the products that they can give you. Farm animals in their own right are a type of machinery in the medieval period. And they also change over time in terms of what the most popular animal to use for what is. In the earlier medieval period, we start to see the heavy plow come into use. It's a great new technology that allows you to slice through the heavier, more clay-based soils that we have in Northern Europe. The heavy plow, as the name indicates, is kind of heavy. So in order to pull one, you're going to use teams of oxen. The oxen will have what we call an ox collar over their neck. This allows them to pull the plow along with the human behind it guiding it through the fields. Later in the medieval period, however, we come up with the horse collar. A horse collar means that you can use horses to plow instead of oxen. Previous to the invention of the horse collar, we weren't exactly sure how to have a horse pull a plow without suffocating them. Horses, although they are not as strong as oxen, are much faster, so they can pull a plow faster through a field, and it actually speeds the work up. Horses are also really useful in their own right. You can use them for transportation. You can use oxen to pull carts, but because they tire more easily, it's better to use horses. So if you have a horse collar instead of an ox collar, it means that you can reduce the amount of livestock that you have for plowing, and the livestock that you have is a little more useful. Peasantry generally also has one hitch in that it's definitively tied to nature. You can't make wheat sprout in January, so you're always going to have to be doing things at a specific time of year that benefit that. It doesn't matter how hard you try, it's not going to be time to slaughter a pig in the middle of July. It just doesn't work that way. Another huge advantage that people in the medieval period have, at least in the high and late medieval period, is something that we call the medieval warm period. This spans from about the year 900 to about the year 1300, where Europe experiences a particularly warm and stable climate. So suddenly, winters are a little bit shorter, summers are a little bit longer, and you have a larger growing period for things. We see this reflected in stuff like what is called the labors of the year. It's a typical medieval art trope. And if you see pictures of December, for example, you'll see peasants engaging in their normal December activities, which are slaughtering pigs and baking bread. But there's no snow on the ground. In conjunction with the great medieval developments of the new tech, this means more food for more people and more happy peasants. These new technologies are very advanced, and it's the most advanced that Europe had ever been up to this point. Romans, for as much as they did do that is very interesting, couldn't come up with this. They did not have heavy plows, they did not have horse collars, and they did not have the three-field system. Suddenly, places like Germany or England can sustain much larger populations because they have peasants who are able to feed people using inventions like the horse collar, like the three-field system, and like the heavy plow. This is real tech, and it's a real advancement for society as a whole. We have one very interesting family, the Collinses, who are a great example of how peasants can really rise in the world. We first meet them through the means of Thomas Collins, the head of the family. He's a very well-to-do peasant. When we first meet him in the 1270s, we see that he owns half a virgate of land, which means about 15 acres or so. That's a lot of land. He also raises livestock like cattle and sheep, and some geese, which are a very nice little cash crop at Christmas or Michaelmas. Everybody likes to eat a goose. So he's doing extremely well. And we know also that his wife is brewing beer. So we know that there's a lot of money coming in for him, and he's definitely someone that you and I would class as well-to-do, if not simply middle class. All of this eventually changes, though, when we next catch up with him. There's a gap in the records from about 1282 to 1292, and when we see Thomas again, his fortunes have come down slightly. This was a man who was super well connected in his community. He was serving as a pledge. A pledge would mean that if someone else says, oh, I owe some money, Thomas would say, he's good for it and I will put my own land up. Thomas can't be a pledge anymore. Why? He's in debt. And he's in pretty serious debt. He comes to our attention through the court records because there's someone called Walter from Oldbury who sues Thomas because he owes him 5 shillings. Sounds probably like not much money, but for Thomas at the time, this is a real problem because he can't pay 5 shillings back. He's mortgaged all of his crops to someone else to pay off other debts. Mortgaging your crops is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's like mortgaging your house now. You'll say, okay, well, I've got my barley crop coming in the autumn, and so after I take that to market, you will get the proceeds from that barley if you give me money now. Walter is demanding his 5 shillings, Thomas can't pay it back, and Thomas is in a real dilemma here. It means that he has to sell one of the only things he possibly can, his land. But of course, Thomas doesn't own his land. He is a serf. Technically, the abbey owns his land, so the only person that he can sell his land to is the abbey. This is a really difficult circumstance to be in because obviously you can't demand, the best price possible. It's just whatever the abbey will give you. For the land that Thomas holds, the abbey gives him £2. Now, that definitely covers his debt to Walter, it covers his other debts, but it also means that the family are in real trouble now. There's 9 mouths to feed, and they're suddenly having to do so based only on Thomas's wife's land that she brought into the marriage through her dowry. This is interesting because it does show us that peasant women even do have some power and some control over their circumstances. Land that comes into a marriage is still their land, and Thomas's wife can't be forced to sell it if she needs to. They still need to make some money somehow, and the only real way to do that is if they can farm and take part in the generalized agricultural community that they live in. Unfortunately, it seems like that is not enough to ever get Thomas back to the same standing in the community that he enjoyed. He dies in the year 1312, and when he does, he's massively in debt again. His lands do pass to his wife and daughters, only 2 of whom have been married off, so you still got 6 women who need to be supported somehow. If we look for any records of them, by the year 1319, all of the Collins sisters are gone. We're not exactly sure what happened. It could be that all of the Collins sisters simply moved away. That would be possible for them because they're women. They might be tied to the land, but the abbey is going to be less interested in forcing them to stay in place because they'll be seen as less productive peasants. If they need help tilling their crops, for example, why not just get some men in there to do it for them, people who don't have to ask for help? So it might be that they decide to try their luck somewhere else and simply moved away. Very unfortunately also, it's equally as possible that they simply all died. From the years 1317 to 1319, there was a continent-wide disaster called the Great Famine. As the name indicates, there simply wasn't enough food to go around. The Great Famine is a very serious event. It really does hurt the majority of the population in Europe, and we do see a huge drop in population at the time. The Collins sisters very well may have fallen victim to this. In the 1300s, we exit the medieval warm period. The temperature begins to drop and Europe begins sliding into what we call the Little Ice Age. We can see again in medieval paintings like the Labors of the Year, suddenly we have December scenes of peasants slaughtering pigs in the snow instead of in the mud. So it means that we do know that the winters are colder and longer. But also there's been 2 years of extensively heavy rains and flooding. The crops simply can't grow. So there's a large mortality across the continent because there just isn't enough food to go around. This impacts peasants more than it impacts other layers of society. Say you're the local abbey. Their risk is sort of spread out over all of the peasants that they oversee. Those peasants still have to pay them their rent, they still have to pay them their crops. So they're getting fewer crops in, but it's still some of everybody's crops instead of being completely dependent on one specific patch of land. So when we think about peasants, we think of them as largely agrarian and in the countryside. For a good reason, you sort of have to do your farming in the countryside. However, that doesn't mean that they don't have any links to London itself. Just behind me, the Clothfair Street opens up onto the Smithfield. In the medieval period, this might actually have been referred to as the Smooth Field, and it's where peasants would bring their cattle, sheep, pigs, in order to be slaughtered and sold at market. From the peasant's perspective, Smithfield is also an extraordinarily important place because it's the scene of one of the most important parts of the Peasants' Rebellion. The Peasants' Rebellion in England is part of a series of peasants' rebellions that we see in the 14th century across the continent. Here in England, it's led by a man named Wat Tyler. Wat Tyler is a peasant himself, but he's someone who thinks that he sees a world where peasants can take greater control. He's one of the first people that really starts arguing that there are generalized rights of men as a whole, and that peasants are more than just a sort of implement to till your land. They're people who deserve the same rights as we do. Also attached to Wat Tyler's rebellion is a man called John Ball. He's a popular preacher. There's a very famous quote often attributed to John Ball that we think might be spurious, which is, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then a gentleman?" This idea is that Adam and Eve were not noble, everyone has the same rights in God's eyes, so why is it that peasants have such a much more difficult shake in society? The peasants get together and they have an actual military rebellion. They famously come to London and besiege it. And they do really well, surprisingly. They take over London, they burn down the Savoy Palace, which is in the place of the Savoy here. Instead of looting all the goods from the Savoy Palace, though, they burn them all. They're not here to steal, they want to start a new society where everyone is on equal footing. They then come and meet up with the Lord Mayor of London on the Smithfield, led by their leader, Wat Tyler. Here, it's unclear exactly what happens, but some kind of scuffle breaks out and Wat Tyler is stabbed. He ends up dying. This is a huge blow to the Peasants' Rebellion because without a leader, they become much more fractious. There's no one really driving them forward with a real vision at this point in time. Eventually, the peasants are completely broken. King Richard II gives a very famous speech where he tells the peasants that they are rustics, and rustics they will remain. He wants to make a point that peasants simply cannot see themselves as on equal footing with nobles or indeed himself, the king. They exist in order to give the nobility goods, and they have to know their place as rusticated. Here on the side of Smithfield Market, we finally have a memorial to the Peasants' Rebellion. I say now because it wasn't until 2015 that we had anything at all memorializing the Peasants' Revolt. This is despite the fact that the Peasants' Rebellion was something that affected the largest number of people in the 14th century at the time. I know I keep saying this, but it's 80% of the European population that are peasants. So the Peasants' Rebellion is one of the most important things in the lives of average people in England in the 14th century. Despite this, we still don't tend to treat peasants as though they're worthy of remembrance or important enough for it. All of this is particularly interesting because one of the things that we see after the years of famine, after the years of Black Death, is that within society, peasants live in a much more marginal position in the medieval period. And this is how medieval society likes it. Nobles simply don't want to give up their very privileged position in society, nor does the church. The church can't have hundreds of monks copying away in scriptoria if they can't be fed. Nobles can't spend all of their day learning how to sword fight if they have to be tilling fields. They depend on a certain class of person not having any choice in the matter. One of the frustrating things when we're trying to uncover the history of peasants in the medieval period is it's so difficult to find it. If they're 80% of the population, why is it that I have to come to a nunnery in order to find a barn? Their lands change hands all the time. And in fact, a lot of the time, their lands aren't their lands. So if you build a building, it's not necessarily going to be handed down through generations to come in your family. It might get taken over by someone like an abbey. Here at abbeys, we can uncover what it might be like for peasants more directly because they are held in the hands of the incredibly rich. Interestingly, here at Denny Abbey, one of the reasons why we have this great old barn is because after the dissolution of the monasteries, this is actually handed back over to farmers. Buildings like this are huge, monumental, and really important. So you wouldn't tear something like this down, especially not if you're an industrious farmer trying to make their way in the world. You'll take a huge barn like this if it's handed to you. It can be frustrating for us as historians or people who want to know more about medieval lives that we don't get to hear directly from peasants, that they are kind of considered not important enough to conserve their history. So it's our job to uncover the evidence of their tech, their lives, and their buildings where we can find it. That's why it's important to come to places like Denny Abbey to remember the people whose stories we don't hear from.
Join me in the next chapter as we visit the Grocers' Company Hall and discover what life was like for those in the guilds.